March 15, 1944, 28,000 feet above Brunswick, Germany, Lieutenant Robert Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group lined up his P-47 Thunderbolt behind a Focke-Wulf 190. The German fighter filled his gun sight perfectly. The textbook shot every American pilot had practiced 1,000 times at gunnery school. Then Johnson did something that would have earned him a failing grade just months earlier. He deliberately aimed 2 feet ahead of the Focke-Wulf's nose and fired into empty air. The German pilot, seeing tracers pass in front of his canopy, instinctively broke left directly into Johnson's stream of fire. The Focke-Wulf disintegrated. Johnson hadn't missed. He had aimed where the enemy would be, not where he was. Across the skies of Europe and the Pacific, American fighter pilots were discovering a counterintuitive truth that would revolutionize air combat. The secret to winning dogfights was making the enemy think you missed, then punishing his predictable evasion. The transformation began in the blood-soaked skies over Guadalcanal in August 1942. The crisis emerged during the first weeks of the Guadalcanal campaign. Marine Fighter Squadron 221 faced an impossible situation. Their F-4F Wildcats were slower and less maneuverable than Japanese Zero fighters, yet they had to win or the campaign would fail. Major John L. Smith watched his pilots return with ammunition expended, but no confirmed kills. On August 20, 1942, Captain Marion Carr returned visibly frustrated. He had fired over 800 rounds at a Zero from perfect range. The Zero took hits but escaped. That evening, Smith gathered his pilots and analyzed gun camera footage. What they discovered changed everything. Carl's hits were all behind the Zero's cockpit. He had aimed perfectly at where the Zero was. But by the time bullets traveled 200 yards, the Zero had moved 14 feet. Carl was hitting tails instead of engines. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Bauer proposed something radical. What if we deliberately missed? What if we fired at empty air and let them fly into our bullets? The next morning, Smith authorized the experiment. That afternoon, VMF-221 shot down 8 Zeros for no losses. Japanese pilots, seeing tracers pass ahead, instinctively broke toward apparent safety, flying directly into the bullets behind the visible tracers. The mathematical challenge was formidable. A fighter traveling 300 miles per hour covers 440 feet per second. Bullets travel 2,800 feet per second. At 400 yards, bullets require 0.43 seconds to reach the target. The target moves 190 feet in that time, nearly 2/3 of a football field. Human brains cannot consciously calculate these variables in fractions of seconds. The solution lay in training the subconscious through repetition until deflection. Shooting became instinct. The breakthrough came when Major Thomas Maguire arrived in the Southwest Pacific in March 1943. Maguire developed a training program that revolutionized American gunnery. His key insight was that the human eye naturally tracks moving objects. Looking at the target causes pilots to aim at the target, guaranteeing a miss. Maguire's solution: don't look at the target. Look at the point in space where the target will be. By April 1943, Maguire's methods had spread throughout 5th Air Force. Average rounds fired per kill dropped from over 2,000 to under 500. Kill-to-loss ratios improved from 2-to-1 to 5-to-1. The real revolution occurred when pilots realized deliberate missing could be weaponized. Captain Charles MacDonald pioneered the shepherd's shot. Instead of firing to kill, he would fire deliberately ahead of the enemy's nose, triggering instinctive evasion. The Japanese pilot would brake hard, believing he had evaded, flying directly into MacDonald's wingman's perfectly positioned guns. Major Greg Boyington's Black Sheep Squadron refined this further. His pilots worked in pairs with defined roles. The herder triggered evasion. The killer waited where the predictable break would occur. They recognized that Japanese pilots had standardized defensive maneuvers. When attacked from the left rear, they broke right and down. This predictability became a fatal vulnerability. The Black Sheep scored 28 kills in their first month using these tactics. In Europe, the challenge was different. German pilots flew less maneuverable aircraft but used superior energy tactics. Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Semke of the 56th Fighter Group analyzed gun camera footage and noticed German pilots instinctively dove when fired upon. Their heavy fighters accelerated quickly in dives. Semke developed the pushdown tactic. American pilots would fire deliberately high, tracers passing over the canopy. The German pilot would push forward on the stick, diving for safety. But the second burst was aimed at where the diving aircraft would be. The 56th Fighter Group shot down 59 German aircraft in January 1944 alone using this technique. German intelligence eventually recognized American pilots were using unusual gunnery. A February 1944 report noted enemy pilots fire at predicted future positions rather than at aircraft itself. But recognizing the problem and solving it were different. German pilot training had collapsed. New pilots arrived with less than 100 hours total time, lacking experience to counter sophisticated tactics. The psychological aspect proved as important as the ballistic. When a pilot sees tracers passing close, his hindbrain takes over. The subconscious screams danger and demands immediate evasion. American pilots exploited this by creating forced choice scenarios. The enemy pilot had two options: maintain course or evade. The overwhelming majority chose evasion, committing to a predictable flight path. The deliberate miss defined the danger zone. The enemy's evasion took him into the kill zone. If you're fascinated by how American tactical innovation overcame technical disadvantages through psychology and training, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We dive deep into the untold stories of World War II, revealing how battles were won through intelligence and adaptation. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss our next video. By mid-1944, American training had been restructured around deflection shooting. The gunnery school at Matagorda Island, Texas, taught specific sight pictures for different angles. 30 degrees off required 1 aircraft length lead. 60 degrees needed 2.5 lengths. 90 degrees demanded 3 to 4 lengths. Beyond mechanics, instructors taught reading subtle cues that predicted evasion. A wing dip preceded a hard brake. Nose-up attitude indicated a zoom climb. Reading these signs gave pilots critical fractions of a second to adjust aim. The deflection revolution extended to bombers. B-17 gunners faced even more complex calculations, shooting from moving platforms at moving targets from multiple angles simultaneously. They practiced against towed targets and studied film of actual attacks. German fighters typically attacked from 12 o'clock high or 6 o'clock low. For frontal attacks, deflection was minimal, but closure rate was extreme, exceeding 600 miles per hour. Combined, gunners learned to start firing at 800 yards. For tail attacks, deflection became critical. German fighters approaching from 6 o'clock low at angles required gunners to lead the target, firing at empty sky. Staff Sergeant Michael Aroth, a ball turret gunner, scored 5 confirmed kills. His secret was predictive shooting. "I never aimed at the fighter. I aimed at where he had to go. If he was coming from 4 o'clock low, I knew he'd continue that angle. I fired at empty air along his projected path. 3 times, fighters flew right into my stream. Formation gunners coordinated fire, creating apparent gaps that actually funneled attackers into concentrated fire zones. Colonel Curtis LeMay developed staggered box formations, positioning aircraft so each plane's guns covered others with minimal deflection angles. German pilots learned to respect flying fortress formations. Attacking the bomber streams became suicide. The Messerschmitt 2062 jet presented new challenges in late 1944. The 2062 approached 100 miles per hour faster than conventional fighters. Initial bomber-gunner struggles led to rapid adaptation. Within weeks, specialized training distributed jet engagement techniques. Gunners opened fire at 1,000 yards with increased lead of 4 to 5 aircraft lengths. By March 1945, gunners were scoring kills against 2062s regularly. Fighter pilots also adapted. Lieutenant Colonel John Meyer shot down 2 Me-2062s in April 1945 using predictive positioning. He waited near known 2062 bases and attacked during vulnerable landing approaches when jets were low on fuel. The kamikaze threat in 1945 demonstrated both power and limitations of deflection shooting. Navy pilots defending carriers achieved extraordinary kill rates, often 80 to 90%. But sheer numbers sometimes overwhelmed defenses. Lieutenant Eugene Valencia developed the Valencia Weave, 2 fighter pairs weaving above the fleet. Kamikazes that evaded head-on passes flew into perpendicular fire from the second pair. By war's end, American deflection shooting had evolved from desperate innovation to systematic science. Training manuals codified techniques. Gun camera footage from top aces was analyzed. Gunnery schools taught standardized methods. In 1942, American pilots averaged over 2,000 rounds per kill. By 1945, under 500 rounds per kill, a 400% efficiency improvement. Major Thomas McGuire, whose training methods were central to the revolution, died January 7, 1945, when his P-38 crashed during low-altitude combat. With 38 victories, he was America's second-highest ace. His death resulted from violating principles he taught, engaging at extremely low altitude with minimal maneuvering room. The legacy extended far beyond World War II. Korean War, American pilots flying F-86 Sabres against MiG-15s achieved 7-to-1 kill ratios despite dogfight equivalent aircraft. The advantage was training. Many were World War II veterans who had mastered deflection shooting. Vietnam saw temporary regression as guided missiles replaced gun combat training. Kill ratios dropped below 2-to-1. The solution was Top Gun and Fighter Weapons School, teaching air combat based directly on World War II lessons. Kill ratios immediately improved, eventually exceeding 20-to-1. Today's fighter pilots employ sensors and weapons their predecessors couldn't imagine, yet fundamental principles remain relevant. Modern air combat still rewards predicting enemy behavior, forcing opponents into disadvantageous positions, executing counterintuitive tactics under stress. Technology has changed profoundly. Psychology remains constant. The story of American pilots learning to deliberately miss represents more than tactical innovation. It demonstrates analytical thinking applied to combat problems. American pilots didn't accept initial failures as proof of enemy superiority. They studied defeats, identified real problems, developed innovative solutions. The deflection shooting revolution succeeded because it was based on understanding reality rather than accepting doctrine. Traditional gunnery taught aiming at targets because that's what marksmanship means. But aerial combat wasn't rifle shooting. Targets moved in 3 dimensions at hundreds of miles per hour. Conventional principles didn't apply. Success required recognizing this and developing new principles. This willingness to question assumptions became a defining characteristic of American military culture. German and Japanese militaries, despite early successes and undeniable skill, proved less adaptable. Both cultures emphasized following doctrine and respecting hierarchy. Innovation from below was discouraged. This rigidity became a strategic vulnerability. American pilots at Guadalcanal questioned their training and developed new techniques within weeks. Those techniques spread throughout theaters within months. Within a year, they had been systematically analyzed, refined, incorporated into standardized training. The entire fighter force was retrained. German and Japanese forces never developed comparable solutions. Individual pilots learned through experience, but institutional learning didn't occur. New pilots arrived without needed training. Veterans developed personal techniques, but couldn't pass them to newcomers. Each pilot learned the same lessons personally, often dying in the process. The mathematical precision of deflection shooting, psychological manipulation of enemies, and systematic training created a compounding advantage that grew stronger as war progressed. American pilots became more capable, while enemy pilots became less capable. The gap widened until unbridgeable. By August 1945, American fighter pilots had achieved something unprecedented. They developed a system allowing even average pilots to consistently defeat more experienced opponents. They proved training and tactics could overcome individual skill differences. They transformed air combat from individual contest to systematic process. Final statistics tell the story brutally. American fighters achieved overall kill ratios exceeding 4-to-1 in both theaters. Top aces like Bong, McGuire, and Gabreski achieved personal ratios exceeding 20-to-1. American losses were consistently replaced faster than destroyed. Lost pilots were replaced with better trained aviators. The system improved continuously, while enemy systems deteriorated. The question that began this story has a simple answer. American pilots deliberately missed because hitting on purpose wasn't working. They recognized the problem wasn't marksmanship, but understanding. They realized aerial combat wasn't about hitting a target, but predicting behavior and denying space. Perfect aim at the present guaranteed missing the future. This intellectual flexibility, this willingness to embrace counterintuitive solutions, this systematic approach to learning, these were the real weapons that won the air war. Technology mattered, production mattered, numbers mattered, but none would have been decisive without tactical innovations that multiplied effectiveness. American pilots didn't win because they were braver. They didn't win because their aircraft were universally superior. They won because they learned faster, adapted better, thought more systematically. They won because they were willing to deliberately miss, trusting that understanding where enemies would be mattered more than seeing where they were. The legacy lives on in every fighter pilot. Since specific techniques evolved with technology, underlying principles remain eternal. Predict rather than react. Think systematically rather than instinctively. Trust training over impulse. Create situations favoring your strengths. These lessons, learned in blood over Guadalcanal, refined over Germany, perfected through systematic analysis, remain the foundation of air combat doctrine worldwide. When Lieutenant Robert Johnson fired ahead of that Focke-Wulf over Brunswick on March 15, 1944, he wasn't just shooting down an enemy. He was demonstrating the culmination of a revolution that transformed aerial warfare. He had learned to see the future, predict behavior, deny space rather than hit targets. He had mastered the counterintuitive truth that missing deliberately was the path to victory. That lesson, taught through millions of practice rounds and thousands of combat missions, changed warfare forever. It proved the human mind, properly trained and systematically applied, could overcome any technical disadvantage. It demonstrated innovation and adaptation could multiply effectiveness far beyond numerical superiority alone. It showed victory belonged not to those who followed doctrine, but to those who questioned it, improved it, perfected it. The American pilots who learned to deliberately miss and thereby won every dogfight weren't just warriors. They were scientists applying experimental method to combat. They were teachers spreading knowledge systematically. They were innovators, refusing to accept defeat as inevitable. They were the embodiment of a system valuing learning over tradition, evidence over assumption, results over doctrine. Their victory in skies over 2 oceans during 4 years of brutal combat established principles valid today. Technology changes continuously. Combat psychology remains constant. Understanding that psychology, predicting behavior, creating situations that exploit it, these skills determine victory, regardless of specific weapons. This is the enduring legacy of pilots who discovered that hitting every target began with learning to miss on purpose.